The very first thing that you should do when you're starting to work on a project is just make sure that it's in the budget. If you don't know how much to estimate, then talk to your colleagues, reach out to a few vendors. You're not committing to anything, you're just asking for a ballpark, and let them know, I'm asking for this so we can put it in the budget for the next year. It's important early on to identify who will take on certain roles. And some key roles to think about: who will be approving the project, signing the contract, and negotiating that contract. Also, who will provide feedback on the milestones as well, and who will review the final product.
Also, when you're in the planning stages, a couple important things: define the goals of your project, and especially in technology projects, the goals are pretty easy. If you want to launch a website, you want to launch a website. If you're updating your CRM, you want to update your CRM, and that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about kind of what do you want to happen as a result of whatever project you're taking on. So really thinking beyond the immediate goals of the project, kind of long-term and big picture when you're talking to your firm's management committee or executive committee, or you're talking to your practice group leaders, in their minds, what is the goal? Why are we doing this? Why are we investing this money, and why are we spending the time to do this?
So next is requirements gathering. And remember, there's a distinction between this and the goals. So for example, if you're talking about launching a new webinar solution, the requirement is not a new webinar solution. The requirement is this has to be accessible for people to watch the webinars on their mobile device, or we have to find some way to make sure that people can get CLE even if they're, if it is a webinar and not an in-person program, or, so I think what you may find when you're beginning to gather requirements is that there's this overflow. Everyone has something to tell you. Everyone wants to give you requirements, and you'll have to manage that. As the project manager, it's something you have to manage.
You may have worked with 3 different PR agencies. You might have all of that experience, and you might know where the project needs to go eventually. But if you don't take the time to gather the requirements and the expectations of what your people in-house are thinking, then you're setting yourself up for problems later on. Additionally, when you're looking at who's using your project, most of the time we go, okay, we got to make the lawyers happy. Yeah, you do. But if the lawyer's not the person inputting the data into the system, you've got to include some input from the secretaries or the paralegals, getting the input from the people who are going to be using the system on a daily basis, because they might have other things that they need to include that the lawyers might not be aware of. So when you're gathering your requirements for your system, you need to have those conversations. They will make your project better in the long run.
The vendor selection process can be a really educational experience. You can learn a lot from reviewing proposals and from the interview process, even things that you didn't think of about your project. So even if you have a particular vendor or two in mind that you'd like to use, I would suggest you broaden the list of vendors that you talk to.
Whenever you're working with a vendor that has not had deep experience with law firms, you as an in-house person really need to educate them on what it's like to work with lawyers.
And a lot of times firms are also hesitant to use RFPs, but again, it takes a little bit of time to put an RFP together, but the responses that you get often give you a lot of information that you may not have had before about what you can expect in a project. So use it as an educational experience if you can. There's always something new you can learn about what's out there.
You do want to make sure that people are seeing the schedule. Just because you put it on a shared calendar doesn't mean people actually look at the calendar. Sometimes what you're doing with that is one of the simplest things is to change up the notices for how far out in advance. The average meeting gets a 15-minute notice. That doesn't really work when somebody has to deliver something. You might be able to set your notices to communicate that, in 3 days you're going to be on this conference call and expected to deliver the following items. Whenever you're looking at your time frame, there's best case scenario, there's reality, and then there's lawyer time. And so I tend to pray for reality and plan for lawyer time, because it's just how it happens.
Get a regular status meeting on the calendar, even if you have to cancel sometimes. Maybe it's every week, maybe it's every other week. It just depends on the project. When we were working with a media relations firm, we had a status call every 2 weeks. When things are intense during a website project, you may have multiple status calls within a week. But having regular status calls planned with an agenda and making sure they happen can hold both sides accountable. A lot of times when we had status calls with vendors, when I was in-house in a law firm, it held us accountable because we owed them information. So can't emphasize enough the importance of that. Have people at all different levels in the firm test whatever the product is, because guaranteed, after a while in a project, you're looking at things so many times, you can't even see things anymore. So definitely include different people in the testing process. And you can measure what you're testing against the benchmarks that you set at the beginning, because hopefully you set the benchmarks at the beginning. So test. That's pretty self-evident. The other thing I wanted to talk about here is communication, having a communications plan. Somewhere midway through the project, if not sooner, you need to think about how you're going to communicate with the firm about rolling it out, because you have a steering committee or you have a pilot group that you're working with, and sometimes how you roll a project out can make or break its success.
And finally, after you've launched, before you run out to the bar and pop the champagne or whatever, however you celebrate, make sure you go over the lessons learned, because even though everything is so clear in your mind right now, in 6 months, in 3 years, you'll probably forget some of those lessons learned. What were the victories and disappointments? What was the ROI?